Hi, I'm Kaye Spivey. In the past, I've talked about methods for critiquing a poem and how to get started both reading and writing poetry. I feel like time and time again we fall back on the old adage that poetry is subjective, and thus what makes a poem good is felt only by the reader on a personal level. To some extent this is true, but like with novels, you can subjectively enjoy what is objectively a terrible book. There's nothing wrong with your enjoyment of it, but that doesn't mean it's great literature. There are elements that make up an objectively good novel. These are things like plot, voice, character, etc. We can evaluate a poem the same way and rely on objectivity to determine whether or not a poem is good outside of your own enjoyment of it. First off, we need to define the difference between objectivity and subjectivity.
Something objective is not influenced by personal feelings or opinion and is considered representing facts. Something subjective is based on or influenced by personal feelings, taste, or opinions.
Now let's establish what rules we can use to establish whether or not a poem is objectively good or not. In some cases, this will help us determine whether or not a poem is a poem at all. So I've determined 3 key features that will be our criteria for evaluating poetry. Number 1, poetic elements. Number 2, internally consistent. And number 3, realization of intent. Let's break each of these down a little bit more. First of all, these are the poetic elements. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some of the main ones that we're going to use for this video. Now, a poem can have many of these and can even use one of them many different times. However, for the purpose of keeping this analysis relatively simple, let's say that to be a good poem, a poem must contain at least 2 of these poetic elements. If no poetic elements are present, then realistically the poem is not a poem. Keeping in mind again that this list is not an exhaustive list of poetic elements. Internal consistency. This means that a poem's structure and themes have consistency throughout the poem. If a poem has an obvious meter or rhyme scheme, this should hold throughout the poem. Or should it deviate, it should be obvious and necessary to the poem why that happened. If a poem starts off talking about one subject, that subject should still be relevant, even if only on a metaphorical level, by the end of the poem. If the poet has chosen to forego punctuation or capitalization, sort of like the style of E. E. Cummings, is that consistent throughout the entire poem? Don't forget that punctuation is part of the map for how poetry is read. So choosing to do without does have an effect on the poem. Internal consistency shows mastery over the poem, and a lack of it shows a lack of skill on the part of the poet. There are exceptions in the case of a dramatic change in theme, such as the ending of a sonnet. Last but not least is realization of intent. For this one, think about the old adage in playwriting. If a gun is on the mantelpiece in the first act, it should go off by the 3rd act. Poetry works in a similar way. Though we should always go into reading a poem with no expectations for it, the poem should set up what it intends to do early on. If it is telling a story, it should set the scene. If it's painting a picture, that picture should be vivid. If it's political, it should tell us why we should care. If it does this effectively, the end of the poem should feel like the natural end, like the poem has wrapped up and left us with the feeling it intended us to have, even if that feeling is uneasiness or frustration. This is a little bit harder to explain than the first 2, and people will start swaying towards subjectivity with this one. So I'm going to give us some examples of how to assess a poem using these 3 criteria to show you what I mean.
The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. First criteria, poetic elements. This poem contains hyperbole or the exaggeration in the case of the first stanza, as well as vivid description and assonance, red and wheel, glazed and rain, beside and white. Second criteria, internally consistent. The structure is consistent, 4 equal stanzas, each with lines of 3 words followed by 1. There's no rhyme scheme and there's no punctuation throughout. 3. The realization of intent. The first line creates an anticipation. What depends on what? The poem follows this by leaving you with an explicitly vivid image in your mind's eye. The intent becomes you having the same mind image as the writer. The poem depends upon all those elements being together and making it from William Carlos Williams' eye to your mind. In this case, it is successful. Let's do another poem you're probably familiar with, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it's queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkness evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Let's look at the criteria. For poetic elements, let's start off with rhyme. The rhyme scheme may seem a little bit strange at first, but it follows AABA, BBCB, CCDC, DDD. There is vivid description throughout the poem, hyperbole or exaggeration, meter, and symbol, woods as a final place of rest. Internally consistent. You'd be hard-pressed to find fault with Frost's meter and rhyme because he was a stickler for them. The DDD rhymes at the end seem to be out of place, but that is a natural poetic form that you see in poems such as sonnets. The repeated rhyme wraps things up. The punctuation is in regular sentence structure throughout. And 3, the realization of intent. The melancholy and hopeless nature developed from the first stanza ends up realized by the last stanza. The language of the poem throughout contributes to the not necessarily depressed, but heavy and tired nature of the poem. The rhyme scheme also dictates a wrapping up, as the rhyme has carried on to the next. In the final stanza, the rhyme does not carry on, but settles us, repeating the final thought instead. I'll do one last poem for good measure. Let's do poem 314 by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. The sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, and yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. The poetic elements. The metaphor is stated immediately, hope as a bird, and has a strong rhyme scheme, a meter, and stanza lengths which are consistent in Emily Dickinson's poetry. It's also internally consistent. She's another one you'd be hard-pressed to find structural issues with. If you do find fault with her dashes, I will try and leave some links below to articles about the dashes she used in her poetry and how they have been changed and interpreted throughout history. Realization of intent. Because the poem states its subject in the first line, it makes us ask why hope is the thing with feathers. Why does the metaphor make sense? The rest of the poem then neatly describes the way in which this bird struggles may be like hope because of the way it affects the poet and thus the reader. Lastly, to help drive this home, I'd like to use these same rules on one of my own poems. This poem is called Cure and comes from my chapbook, An Isolated Storm. Cure by Kaye Spivey. Use bitter leaves, they say, to cure the cold that leaks beneath the window frame. Use bitter leaves to shake out all the pain. Crush them and drink out the oils that kept them green and new. They'll warm the deepest cold. Use bitter leaves, they say. It's the only cure you haven't tried. Use bitter leaves, because the sweet fruit's nectar only left you ailing. The poetic elements I used in this poem include metaphor, hyperbole, description, and repetition. Internally consistent. This poem is free verse and thus doesn't have a rhyme scheme to fall back on like the ones we've looked at previously, but it does use regular sentence structure and repetition evenly throughout, and the theme of being ill and curing it with natural things is consistent. The realization of intent. Do you think I achieved this? The poem opens with a statement to use bitter leaves, and then goes on to explain why this is necessary. It uses an argument to sway you to the same conclusion at the end. Do these 3 rules work for some of your favorite poems?
Before I end this video, I would like to stress again, none of these rules have to override how you subjectively feel about a poem. A poem can be lacking any of these elements and still be your favorite piece of writing. You can also absolutely hate a poem that does qualify with all of these 3 rules. I mean, maybe you're not a fan of Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and subjectively you feel like it does nothing for you. That's completely okay. The purpose of these rules is to give you a basis for understanding poetry, objectively. There are a lot of poems floating around, good or bad, and it can be really frustrating when you look at something that other people love and you're not able to put into words why you're not a fan of it. Subjectively, maybe that poem isn't doing the same thing for you that it is doing for a lot of other people. However, objectively, it's possible it's a bad poem or that it's not a poem at all. Taking time to break down what makes poetry poetry gives us a deeper understanding of the medium and its capabilities. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment down below, and I will see you again soon. Bye!